So my name to everybody is Kim Myrick, and I'm the co-chair of the conference. We will be in this room for the Welcome and Land Acknowledgement, Introduction, and Keynote speaker this morning. I am the moderator for these sessions. So at this time, I will ask our interim provost and vice president academic pro tempore, Dr. Margaret Steele, to give her welcome address. Welcome, Dr. Steele.
Thanks very much, Kim, and welcome everyone. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the lands on which we reside. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on the lands where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. So welcome to Memorial University's Teaching and Learning Conference 2022. As Kim indicated, my name's Margaret Steele, and I'm the Interim Provost and Vice President Academic at Memorial. I'm delighted to be here today to open this event and welcome the large contingent of participants joining us online. At this time, I ask all of you to please mute your microphones. Live captioning has been enabled for this event, so feel free to use it if you wish. Also, for optimal viewing, we encourage you to adjust your screen layout to stack view. This will ensure the person who is speaking is enlarged on your screen. You can choose this option in the layout menu found in the top right corner of the presentation screen. This is actually Memorial's 4th annual Teaching and Learning Conference. Due to the pandemic, it became a virtual event last year, which was a tremendous success, and so the organizers at our Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning have planned another stellar virtual experience this year. Leading up to the conference today, I saw promotional videos of our 2 keynote speakers, Dr. Anne Braithwaite from the University of Prince Edward Island and Dr. Dolores Mullings from Memorial, both of whom did a wonderful job in generating excitement for their presentations. In Dr. Mullings' video, she noted that this conference is quickly becoming one of Memorial's signature events, and I couldn't agree more. Teaching and learning is fundamental to the work of the university, and in an ever-changing world, it's important we think critically about how we teach, how we inspire students in their learning, and how we can adapt as leaders in teaching and learning in higher education. This conference provides us with an opportunity to learn and explore together so that we can ensure our students have a learning experience that propels them to their greatest potential. The theme for the next 2 days is centered on teaching for change. This is undeniably a timely topic, as we've all experienced many changes to teaching and learning, in particular over the last 2 years, and we continue to experience changes. It's also a theme that opens up conversations about how we can adapt to new ways of connecting, learning, doing, and knowing. Our students are changing, and their needs are changing. As an institution, it has never been more critical for us to offer an equitable and accessible education for all our students and to cultivate and nurture diversity and inclusion. When I joined Memorial University in 2016, I became the first woman to be appointed Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at Memorial. There were much fewer women at the academic leadership table and much less diversity. We have advanced significantly as an institution since that time, which isn't that long ago, with increasing diversity, not just among academic leadership, but also across our entire teaching and learning community. As noted in Memorial's strategic plan, learning at Memorial prepares students to be tomorrow's global citizens, critical thinkers, creative artists, problem solvers, skilled to positively contribute to the province's social, cultural, and economic vitality in the world. Excuse me. I think the theme, Teaching for Change, is very much aligned with that quote. Building global citizens requires us to connect learners with each other, their communities, and the world, to support internationalization and indigenization, to cultivate diversity, and to provide students with a sense of belonging and boundless opportunities to learn and to succeed. By participating in this event, you are all actively working to enhance the learning experience So thank you for taking the time to come together to explore and share insights that will inspire and ignite us. On that note, I would like to give thanks for the incredible contributions of our keynote and plenary speakers and members of the memorial community who are presenting over the next 2 days. We are excited to learn from and with you. Together, we will explore how we can better equip our students to shape their own futures and the world in which we live. I would like to acknowledge and thank all of the organizers of this year's conference for their planning efforts. I know a great deal of work goes on behind the scenes to prepare and to make things run smoothly, so thank you for your commitment. Dr. Christina Thorpe, head of the Department of Psychology in our Faculty of Science, took on the role as the first faculty co-chair of this event, along with Dr. Kim Myrick, Associate Director of Teaching and Learning at the Center for Teaching and Learning. I would also like to acknowledge the CITL Steering Committee, who are actually the master planners behind the event, and the program committee comprised of faculty, staff, and student representatives from across the institution who put together an enriching program for the next 2 days. And last, but certainly not least, thanks to the entire CITL team for hosting this event and engaging members of the university community to organize the program. CITL is a central resource for Memorial, and in addition to supporting our institution's teaching and learning needs, your team provides exceptional leadership to instructors and students. So on that note, I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Christina Thorpe. As I mentioned, Dr. Thorpe is the head of the Department of Psychology in the Faculty of Science. She's the chair of Memorial Senate Teaching and Learning Committee, and she was a 2021 recipient of the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. So please welcome Dr. Christina Thorpe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seal. And good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I had a little bit of nerves this morning because my technology didn't want to work how it was supposed to. I just want to say that, again, I am so pleased that I am co-hosting or co-chairing this year's Teaching and Learning Conference with Kim Myrick. It has been an absolutely fabulous couple of months working with her and everyone else on the steering committee and the programming committees to put together this conference, and I think it's going to be a fabulous 2 days. As you guys probably know, I joined MUN in 2007 as an assistant professor, and I'm now a full professor and head of the psychology department. One of the things that I do like to warn people about when they hear me presenting is that I am originally from Newfoundland, and that means that I talk fast. And that is especially a problem when I am excited and when I'm nervous. And that means you guys are going to get the talking fast times 2. So every now and again, Kim will probably wave at me and kind of tell me to slow down. So I'm keeping an eye on her. But, you know, it is kind of, I tell myself, part of my charm. So we will get used to that, I think. I love teaching and I love building relationships with my students. And I admit that I've struggled a little bit with online teaching. Because for me, even in a really large classroom, it feels like I'm having a conversation with my students. And that's very difficult to do in these types of WebEx meetings. You know, it works okay when there's a few, but when there are a ton of little tiny squares, it's a bit more challenging. So I'm really hoping that you guys will take advantage of the chat feature that's in WebEx to keep the conversations going with me and with all of the presenters in the next few days, and also with each other. So the theme of this year's Teaching and Learning Conference is Teaching for Change. What in the world do we even mean by change in our students? Do we want them to simply emerge from their years here with more knowledge than they came in with? If we want to impart something more than knowledge, what is it that we should be striving to help them change to? And how exactly do we do that? Should we also be looking for changes in ourselves? These are just a few of the questions that I hope that we'll explore together during this conference. Through this experience, I hope that we'll explore how we can equip ourselves and our students to shape their futures and the world in which we live. There are many different topics and ideas that come to mind as we are kind of thinking about the future sessions that we're going to have. But I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk a little bit about my experiences and the way in which I like to think about teaching for change. I was the undergraduate officer and deputy head of the psychology department for 5 years, and I am currently the head of the psychology department. Through the different roles that I've had as teacher and research supervisor and undergraduate officer, and now as the head of the department, I've really come to realize that the way that I can most effectively promote change for my students, my colleagues, and myself is to look at teaching through the prism of mentorship. I warn you, I'm going to use the word mentorship a lot in the next 5 minutes. I kind of wish that it was later in the evening and we could come up with a fun game so that all of you could do something silly every time I mentioned the word mentorship. But it's a bit too early in the morning for that, I think. But you can keep track if you'd like, just for fun. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see mentorship kind of playing that role in teaching for change. So I think that through mentorship, that's how we help to make each student feel that they are a part of Memorial and that they'll be supported as they explore their interests, that they're part of a community, and that it's okay, and in fact desirable to make mistakes, and that it's okay to not know all of the answers. I take time in my first year classes to tell students that, when I ask a question, I don't actually expect them to get it right. And in fact, they're doing the class a favor when they get the wrong answer, because we can learn a lot from those mistakes. And I think that, I try to be a good role model for that. So there's going to be lots of topics that we're going to talk about in the next couple of days that I'm still struggling with, trying to understand myself and trying to incorporate. And so I think it's okay for us to ask and kind of think about those questions. I am a first generation university student. And I remember as an undergrad that feeling of everyone else knew the secret rules and I didn't know what any of them were. I didn't know how to address profs. I'm from Newfoundland, so I'm not going to lie. I did call a few of my profs miss in the first couple of weeks before someone corrected me. That's a common Newfoundland thing. I called my male professor sir. I didn't know when you should call them doctor versus professor. I didn't know if I was going to annoy profs when I showed up at their office hours. Like, did they really want you to come to your office hours, or is that when they want to work, right? Like, I didn't know how it worked. I remember being really embarrassed when my classmates were talking about grad school. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what the difference was between grad school and master's and PhD. And then there was this thing called a PsyD, and sometimes it was an MA, and sometimes it was an MSc, and there was no guidebook. I mean, we're a bit better now, but at that time, I definitely felt like I didn't know what was going on. Never mind practical things like how in the world do you find an honor supervisor, or how do you get a part-time job in a career that's close to what you're studying. I was very lucky in that I stumbled upon Dr. Gerard Martin when I was in third year, and he hired me to work in his research lab. And he taught me how to design an experiment. And one of the things that I really took away from that as a scientist was that I'd had this idea from high school that science was going in and knowing exactly what you were going to do, and that you were never going to make a mistake, right? You just followed the steps and that was it. And Dr. Martin really taught me that, it's really fun when things don't go right, because then you get to problem solve and you get to explore more. And, that kind of mentorship was really important to me. He also encouraged me to go to grad school, and he gave me tips on how to reach out to potential supervisors. And he offered to read my NSERC scholarship applications. In a very weird way, I think one of the most encouraging things that he did was to tell me that he would not supervise me as a grad student, even though I really wanted to stay at home and work with him because we had such a good relationship. But I got an NSERC, that one that he helped me with. And he realized that going somewhere new was what was going to be best for my development. I think he also realized that it might take a little bit of a nudge or maybe even a really big push to get this Newfoundland girl to leave and get out of her comfort zone. Basically, he was an awesome mentor, and he brought about so much change in me. And I really want to be that for other students too. And that's kind of really changed how I think about teaching and think about being a professor. I'd like to think that I have been that for many of my students. I try to get to know them and figure out what they want to learn about and what they want to do after graduation. And we chat about the skills and the experiences that they're going to need to help develop those and to reach those goals. There's lots of examples of things like that I can think of, and that I'm sure all of you can. I had a graduate student a couple of years ago who wanted a career in academia, but had really serious anxiety about public speaking. And we sat down together and came up with a strategy for how we were going to help him to become more confident. And, started with just practicing talks just for the two of us, and to lab meetings and in his classes. And, it was so wonderful watching him, kind of change through that. And it wasn't really part of a curriculum. And he got to the point where he was actually awarded the best talk at our department research day. And he's now a tenure track professor himself at another university in Canada. And again, a wonderful mentor to his own students. And so I think this is something that we kind of help to keep going all the time. Sometimes being a good mentor means helping students to find other mentors. For example, I've had to help students who want to do a program that we don't have at MUN. So, a student who wanted to do computational neuroscience. We didn't really have those people with that exact skill set here. And so, we worked together to find other people that could introduce him to parts of it, and how he could then go away and apply to other programs to do it. He was a very, very bright student. He was straight A. And, you might not have thought that he was one of those students who would need that extra mentorship, but even the really talented students, I think, can benefit from our guidance and support. So this mentorship approach is one way that I teach for change with my students in a one-on-one context. But how do we reach the students that don't necessarily seek us out? And one approach that I use is to incorporate professional development and personal development to my classes, and to dedicate time, like actual class time, to topics such as career planning and networking and stress and time management, and how students can find mentors. We even talk about things like, how do you email a prof? How do you deal with it if you're overwhelmed in your class and you don't think you can meet the deadlines? I find these conversations to be very satisfying, and I had the privilege of teaching a second year course that was required for all of our majors, so I was able to reach a lot of students in that way. One of the funny things is that the students in the class all got used to this presentation. It took a couple of days, and they referred to it as the talk. And people would ask me at the beginning of class, when will the talk be? Because they saw how valuable that was. I also had professors asking me what in the world the talk was. I think they assumed we were talking about the birds and the bees in the writing class or something, but it really was just about all those things that I wish that I knew when I was a student. I have included some guest speakers from the Student Wellness Center, the Career Development Office, the Writing Center, the library, and we have so many wonderful resources on campus. But for some students, they might not know what those resources are, why they're important, or how to access them. And so I find that by bringing them into the classroom, we can create a more equal playing field for all of our students. Over the next few days, we're going to have lots of opportunities to learn more about the supports that we have here at Memorial and how we can incorporate those into our teaching. For example, I noticed that Dr. Jennifer Brown and her colleagues at Student Life, who I've worked with quite a bit, they're going to be talking tomorrow about a pilot program they've done with students doing the MUSEP program about how they can increase their skills awareness. So basically helping them to see the connections between their part-time employment and their opportunities, their part-time employment and real life skills. So I'm going to try to highlight a few talks like that, but there's definitely way too many for me to do in this brief little introduction. Helping students to reach their goals is one way that we teach for change, kind of at the personal level of the student. But I also think that universities are the key for teaching for change at more of a societal level. In the past few years, I've been struck by the amount of misinformation in the media. And it's really hard to figure out what's real and what's not and who we should trust. I mean, if you think just about the last 2 years, right? There's so many experts out there that are talking about COVID and vaccines and, which sometimes the experts are giving different advice and different information. And so how do we teach our students to figure out which sources are reliable? How do we teach them to ask the right questions of the sources that they're reading? How do we teach them to think critically? And I think that that's an issue that's been on the mind of a lot of our colleagues in the past 2 years. And again, there's a couple of presentations on this topic, and I'm really looking forward to learning about what others are doing and how I might incorporate them into my classes as well. Dr. Adrian Peters and Laura Squires and Dr. Linda Rohr have a session on critical digital media literacy that I think will get at some of these questions. So I'm interested in checking that one out as well. Another big question that we've been asked to consider is how do we cultivate citizens to be, or cultivate students to be these global citizens? How do we make our classrooms and our universities and our societies more culturally responsive and inclusive? And how do we make sure that the principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism, how do we make sure that they're central and that they're core to all of our teaching and research and decision making? We are extremely fortunate to have two keynote speakers, Dr. Braithwaite and Dr. Mullings, who are going to address this issue. We also have a panel of students who are going to reflect on the strategies for inclusive decolonized teaching through storytelling and relationship building. And I hope that, we're all going to be able to check out those and quite a few other EDI sessions that are offered throughout the conference. As I said, I know many of us are eager to get back to pre-pandemic days of teaching. Believe me, I really wish that we were all in a classroom together right now and that I could feel like I was having a conversation with you. I wish that we were, having the coffee in between the talks or, getting together over lunch. But as much as I miss those kind of pre-pandemic days, I also think that, we all realize that there were a lot of really new and interesting innovations that came about because of this switch to remote learning. there's lots of ways that we can still connect with each other and with our students. And we're going to have an opportunity to learn about some of these innovations in the next few days. I know that the staff from the Blunden Center are going to give a session on how we can use some of these approaches that we've learned in teaching and learning. Doctors Goodenow and Azam are going to talk about the potential of high flex learning environments. And I'm sure that in our discussions and question and answer periods, we're going to hear a lot more about the strategies that all of us have been using in the past 3 years, and which ones we cannot wait to ditch, and which ones we want to keep using and probably even expand on a little bit. Okay, one last topic that I wanted to mention that I've been thinking about a lot is how do we encourage mental health and mental well-being in our students and ourselves? I think that the pandemic has made many of us reassess what our priorities are. And going back to mentorship, in order for this relationship to exist, we really need to have a healthy, happy, and fulfilled mentees and also mentors, right? So the students need to have this, the instructors, the faculty members. As a department head and a colleague and a friend, I've had so many conversations with faculty and staff and students who are feeling burnt out and overwhelmed. And it's hard because we're extremely passionate about all the aspects of our job, right? I love teaching and research and service, and I strive for excellence in all of these, as I'm sure that all of you guys do as well. But we are constantly being asked to do more, and we want to do more. But the reality is that we can't keep doing more, especially without increased and improved resources. It's funny to think about the number of times that I've talked to my students about the importance of, and I'll say this in quotes because I think sometimes they're overused, but the importance of balance and self-care. But honestly, I do not think I'm a very good role model. And my kids would definitely tell you that I work too much. So, the truth, out of the mouth of babes, right? So I think we all struggle with it. And I know myself, and I know what happens after these conferences. I am going to be ridiculously excited about everything that I'm going to hear about in the next 2 days. I'm going to annoy my colleagues because I'm going to be chatting with them about it in the lunchroom. We are going to have great conversations in the hallway, and I'm going to be motivated to try out lots of new things that I've learned about. I am going to walk away going, oh my God, I really, really need to learn more about this topic, right? I want to research it and I want to find out more, and I want to have time to just sit and think and reflect about it. But how in the world do we add all of that in when, the amount of teaching and research and service and admin that, again, I'm required and want to do already has me working more than a 40-hour week. I've told this story to some of my friends. My 9-year-old son is very convinced that the secret to time travel is in his iPad. So his logic is that when he's on his iPad and he is playing Minecraft or Roblox, time shifts, right? It's only 10 minutes. He's convinced. When I say, Oliver, it's time to get off. You've been on your iPad for an hour. He's like, no way. Nope. I've only been on this thing for 10 minutes. And so he wants us to work together to figure out how we can use that to solve time travel. He's got ideas about blue light in it because he's heard about that. Anyway, so I think maybe between me and Oliver and Apple, that maybe we'll have figured out the solution to time travel in the next couple of years. He's definitely motivated to figure it out. Anyway, that's just a silly little thing. One of these days, Oliver's going to grow up and he's going to be like, why in the world did my mother tell people about this story? because he's going to be afraid that one of you will run with it and steal it from him, and he will have lost out on billions, right? I have, in seriousness, I've definitely tried some strategies. The MUSEP program is wonderful. And I had this realization last year that, they can help with some of this and it's beneficial to them. So I have MUSEP students who sit on my departmental EDI committee and that sit on, or I have a group of them that we work together to do research on the scholarship of teaching and learning. And we talk about those things and they go out and they look up articles and they come back and we talk about it. And so, they help with a little bit. So that's been a wonderful resource that honestly, I hadn't really thought of until recently. I've also had lots of conversations about how to reduce unnecessary administrative burdens. But I do think as an institution, this is something that we all need to be thinking about. And I definitely do not have any solutions to this problem. But like I said at the beginning, for my first year students, I tell them it's okay if we don't know the answers. We just need to think about it. So that's kind of something I'm hoping that we do as well in the next couple of days, and even longer. But I really want, as a mentor, to be a good example. So I think that this is another question that we need to consider as we're talking about teaching for change. So I feel like I just talked a whole lot. And then, like I said, that excitement and nervousness has probably made me talk a little bit quicker. I haven't had a chance to look at the chat. But if you haven't already done so, please use the chat and talk about a little bit about what this theme has meant for you, right? How are you thinking about teaching for change? Are there things that, that I talked about that kind of resonate with you? Are there other ways of teaching for change that you have been considering that I didn't mention? And, maybe we'll kind of get that conversation going. So I'm going to kind of stop right there for a few minutes and kind of check out the chat. I think Kim has hopefully been monitoring it a little bit, and she can kind of tell us what's been going on in there. And then in a few minutes, I will introduce our wonderful keynote speaker, Dr. Anne Braithwaite.
Excellent job, Christina, my co-chair. It's so delightful to be here with you this morning and listen to that. That was fantastic. You time travel, you just did it for me. You took me right back to my day of I remembered standing in the middle of the gym, the university gym, my first day, and you had to find your courses and you had that little square. I'm dating myself, but there was a little square timetable you were given when you went through the door. That's all anybody gave me. And just in that big land of university and buildings and everything, and I stood there alone with that little piece of paper and had to go seek out everything. And what a world today. And to think about, when I graduated undergrad, then the change in me that was there. But today, the changes in our world, that are impacting education and the things that we're going to talk about over the next 2 days. I can't wait to leave too, with the same ideas to try in my classes and to be awakened again to things, that those aha moments that I go, oh, that's what that really means, it's going to be a wonderful, great 2 days. There's in the chat right now, we got, people are kind of talking about the same things, totally relate to the excitement about all the things that we're going to learn over the next couple of days, echoing the importance and mutual benefit of MUSEP program. Like, there's just so much on our campus that we can access and integrate into our curriculum and into everything that we do to help students with their own personal and professional development. It's amazing, and then to grapple with all the topics, of indigenization and equity, diversity, and inclusion. And there's a great breadth and depth of things going to happen over the next 2 days that are hopefully going to enlighten us all. So I think you did a great job of kind of bringing us together on that. So thanks for that. If there's anything else anybody would like to kind of share in the chat, I know Anne has also shared that she has a student this semester to do a wonderful project, on time. So let's not like kid ourselves. Let's open up our imagination like your son Oliver and see, where we can go with our minds over the next couple of days. Our minds are the most beautiful thing that we have in a lot of ways, that have no boundaries if we allow it that freedom to have that. So I'll see if there's anything else anybody wants to share or open up. Feel free to raise your hand or just speak at this point. This is the idea of our conference too, is to engage and to share over the next few days. I will point out before I shut up, excuse me, is that if anybody wants to carry on a conversation that you're getting excited in a session, we do have a new feature this year in our Brightspace venue called Wonder. And it is a space that you can go in and share and talk in different talking circles and, just strike up a conversation, just as if you were in the lobby of a hotel at a conference, or you pulled somebody to the side in a room after after a presentation and have a bit of a chat, and explore ideas together. So check that out. That's definitely a cool thing. So I'll hand it back to the crowd or to you, Christina. Is there anything anybody'd like to kind of comment on at this point? Thanks, Gavin, for sharing the MUSEP link too. Yes.
Yeah, I honestly cannot say enough good things about the MUSEP program and the iSWEP and the grad SWEP and the SWASP, like just ways of getting students involved in research and in service and helping each other. It's a fabulous program. And I don't want to steal the thunder from the talk that's coming, but there is a lot of emphasis on how to help students make those connections, right? Like sometimes it's a struggle for students to realize that they are getting a lot of fabulous skills when they do these kinds of work, and they're kind of helping to find ways to get students to make those connections. So I don't know if I should be talking about it too much. With my luck, there'll be so much demand that then I won't get my students anymore. So, let's maybe not talk about it anymore. We'll leave it. I'll be selfish for a few minutes. Okay. So I think that everybody is probably just as excited as I am to get to hear from our visiting keynote speaker, Dr. Anne Braithwaite. I think that you have all had a chance to read or to watch her video that she had that was on our social media. She is a professor and coordinator of the Diversity and Social Justice Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island, where she has taught since 1998. She is the only faculty member appointed to the program, and she teaches at a wide variety of courses at every level on topics such as identities and place, monsters, freaks, zombies, and cyborgs, disability studies, race and whiteness, and theorizing social justice. I think I would love to take any one of those courses. They all sound fabulous. She is the co-author or co-editor of 3 different books, with a 4th one coming later in 2022. Dr. Braithwaite's scholarly work examines the ways in which disciplines such as women's and gender studies are constructed through languages and narratives that reflect a set of embedded ways of knowing, and asking what versions of discipline these assumptions make possible and what possibilities they also shut down. Dr. Braithwaite is the new Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education Standing Committee for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, in addition to several EDI committees at UPEI. both at UPI and beyond, her passion to engage others in exploring how to bring questions of inclusion and justice to the classroom and to curricular programming. She's the recipient of numerous teaching, educational leadership, and service awards at UPI, the 2014 AAU and Marie McKinnon Educational Leadership Award, and she's a 2021 3M Teaching Fellow. Dr. Braithwaite is joining us today to talk about who's on your syllabus and how that matters. In 2013, theorist Sara Ahmed provocatively asked who appears and who does not appear in our academic curricula and conferences, positing that the reproduction of a discipline can be reproduction of these techniques of selection, ways of making certain bodies and thematics core to the discipline and others not even a part. Sara Ahmed's questions remind us that citational practices are also equity issues, reflecting often unacknowledged assumptions, not only about what gets taken for granted as important knowledge, but also about who is included or excluded as knowers. What perspectives and voices are made visible and centered in the choices we make for our syllabi in our classroom practices. What's overlooked or rendered invisible, and how do these questions matter? In her presentation, Dr. Braithwaite will go through a number of ways in which the issue of citational politics challenges us to revisit what we do in the classroom, in our pedagogical practices, as much as in our curricular choices, and also motivates us how to, together, think more broadly about what building more inclusive knowledge and spaces, basically what teaching for change, we must always consider. Without further delay, please welcome Dr. Anne Braithwaite.
Ooh. Thank you so much for that. There's hands being raised.
Oh, there's some hands being raised, yes.
I thought they got questions already.
Yeah. Do you know what? I think that what it is, Ed, because I have made this mistake myself, is that when you use your little emojis, the hand raise and the hand clap are right next to each other and they look very similar. So sometimes it's like they're giving a high five and sometimes they want to ask a question.
I'll do that. That's cool.
If there is a question, maybe you can raise your hand again right now, just in case we didn't make an assumption. Okay, I think we're all good.
Cool.
Okay, Anne, it's off to you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for like everything that came before it. And I've already said this to a few people, but so like I'm half an hour earlier than you folks, right? So the dog was getting walked at 6:30 this morning, which had him and me very confused. But anyways, here we are. So thank you all for coming this morning. I'm really appreciative. And I'm really looking forward to 2 days of conversation with you all in some way or another. I'm speaking to you this morning from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq people, which we also know in subtler language, at least, as PEI. Because a talk, and I start with this, as we all start with land acknowledgements, because a talk about how to create more just academic practices from our curricula onwards has to start with recognizing the injustices within which we all live, work, and a little bit of administrivia before we begin. So a couple of things. One, please use the chat, right? As Christina and Kim have both been saying, please use the chat along the way. There's also a Q&A function, and Kim's going to be sort of keeping an eye on both of those so that there's lots of time for discussion at the end of all of this. And I'm going to be organizing today by sort of me talking. I don't have slide decks, so I don't do that. So I'm going to be organizing this around a series of reflections and a series of very short think about moments where you get to reflect on something. So I'm going to ask you to either have something to write on or with, or just sit and think, because that's okay too. Or I'm about to do something that you should never do for the first time in a public talk. But I'm going to try a whole new thing that I just heard about yesterday. So yesterday was our teaching conference at UPEI, and the keynote there used something called Woo Clap, which was really cool. So I'm going to try it. It may not work. We'll see. So anyways, I'm going to be talking about recipes in a moment. And I started thinking this is just like the dinner party, right? Where you try out the whole new thing for like a bunch of new people. Anyways, so that's what I'm about to do. So please use the chat a lot along the way. And please sort of be ready to either write something down or reflect to yourself, or we're about to try this, see if this works. I'm going to start you off with a very short think about. Don't you hate classes that make you do a quick write right at the very beginning? So let's see if this works. Hang on a sec. So I'm going to put a link in the chat. And then when you all go to that link, you'll see that I'm starting with what I'm calling, is that working? Well, we'll find out in a moment. I'm starting with what I call think about number 1. If this doesn't work, I have them on another screen and I can share them with you also. Oh, cool. Yeah, okay, terrific. Thanks, folks. And it should, there, see, it's working. So think about number 1. When I say the word citation, what do you think of? Where and how does that term come up for you? And I recognize we're all very differently situated in different disciplines and in different areas of a university also. Where and how does that term come up for you? How is the issue of citation important in academia? What I love about this, you're all seeing the whole screen, right? No, because I haven't shared it with you. I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes to both reflect on this idea, but also to read what's happening very quickly, right? And I did think that with this many people that the answers would be flying, and I'm not sure that we have a lot of time. I apparently can export all of this into at least a spreadsheet. I'm hoping that I can also save it as this image. And so I'll make it available to Darcy and Kim, and it'll somehow show up for everybody afterwards also. And I'm just looking quickly and seeing a lot of same kinds of things that I would say. Oh, giving credit. I like that. Original authors, providing sources. Somebody says MLA. Yeah. Acknowledgement, plagiarism. I'll get to that in a moment. Oh, whoops. All right. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. Go back to get ready for my second one. Reflection number 1. That was fun. I like that. I'm going to try to look up at the chat every so often, but it's going to be difficult, right? All right, so that was our first think about reflection number 1. Let me start with a story, a citation, if you will. Lisa Heltke, in a lovely article that's called Let's Cook Thai, Recipes for Colonialism, that I just finished using in a food and cultural studies class, so it's really been resonating with me, asks at one point, where do recipes come from? And then explores several of what she calls Middle Eastern cookbooks, noting how indebted their predominantly white Western authors are to largely unnamed women cooks in whose kitchens they learned and received many of the recipes. And I'm going to do this a lot when I'm quoting and hope that that kind of captures the quoting idea. How Heltke goes on to ask, should we think about this use of everyday recipes from kitchens around the world? Recipes that remain largely unattributed to anyone in particular until they're published in a cookbook, when they become the property, right, of the cookbook author. Is using these recipes, these ways of cooking and combining ingredients from a number of women doing the everyday tasks of feeding themselves and their families or others, working with and in their own communities to share knowledges about food and food preparation. Is that about borrowing or stealing? Heltke asks. Is there harm, and if so, what kind and to whom, in transposing the knowledges of a particular group of people, those unnamed women cooks, into another format, in this case, a published cookbook with somebody else's name on it? Couldn't one just say that the fact that these are the everyday ways of cooking specific to a time and a place and a group of people, mean that this is simply taken for granted and widely shared knowledge about food anyways? And indeed, how could one attribute a recipe for something as everyday as hummus or tabbouleh in the first place, even if those are also always recipes in those Middle Eastern cookbooks? There's a lot more to Helke's argument, obviously, right? But what I love about it is that she's asking, in this example in particular, she's asking us to think precisely about the question of citation and citational practices, all the kinds of stuff you folks just talked about. On the one hand, of course, her example here raises issues of ownership and even of plagiarizing and copyright, Western legalistic frameworks that are invoked to think about publishing something like a cookbook. And probably the primary way, and certainly in scanning this, we saw people using the language of plagiarizing and copyright and so forth, right? One of the predominant ways in which the issue of citation is important to us in academia. And I suspect, and I saw it also flying by on the screen, many of us also think about things like university codes of conduct and academic integrity. Well, there we go. Thank you. And of course, reward systems for faculties, right? Where we count things like how many citations you have and so forth. But citations are about more than simply legalistic frameworks or notions of ownership or origins of knowledges or recipes. They're about more than surveillance and, excuse me, they're about more than the notions of surveillance and punitive measures meted out for straying too far from certain mandated behaviors, and they're about more than simply reward systems for academic achievement. They also raise, for all of us, a set of questions about how any knowledge or recipe travels or moves and becomes recognized, and about what kinds of values and validations it picks up or accrues along the way. They ask us to notice and to attend to how we know what we know. Again, stuff that people were saying in the think about. They ask us to notice and attend to how we know what we know, to where that knowledge resides, and to how it's transmitted or communicated. So what ultimately fascinates me about Helke's argument here, her exploration of recipes and their origins and cookbooks and how they document, right, recipes, is how, and the question I think she's really highlighting for us is how the issue of relationships is always at the heart of thinking about citations. Her example asks us to think more clearly, more deeply, more carefully about which relationships are made visible and public, such as the one between the cookbook author to us, the cookbook buying audience, and which relationships we remain invisible and unacknowledged and unnamed, the cookbook author to those unnamed women cooks, right, with whom they have encounters and receive recipes in all citations and citational practices. Her example asks us to think more deeply and more carefully about how what we know is always tied to other people, sometimes in times and places from which we are quite distant, sometimes to which we are much closer. Citations are always tied to a variety of sources that we probably can't easily name or trace much of the time, like knowing a recipe for hummus or tabbouleh, for instance. And that, of course, the longer we're in academia, the more that gets exacerbated, right? You do more and more reading, you sort of lose track of where and how all of these knowledges that you're sort of now talking about, how you're going to map them out. So ultimately for me, this article and its thinking about recipes is an example that highlights difficult questions, such as, how is knowledge recognized? Whose knowledge is validated? And who is credited with being a knower? That is, with what kinds of relationships are valued and validated and named, and what kinds aren't. To say that these are all relationships, though, and this is an important point, is most definitely not to invoke some notion that they're all equally, and we could just equally name them, identify them, and insert them where they're missing. Citational practices, we all recognize, are always about power differences. They're about differences of access, of voice or recognition, of value in academia as anywhere else. So while the issue of citation is clearly relevant and important for all of us in thinking about research and scholarly work, right, which a number of those examples that came up on the WooClap showed us, and they're rewarded in a number of ways which we might also want to question and challenge, I want to turn the focus today, 3 pages in, to the issue of citation in our teaching. That is, to the kinds of expected and accepted citational practices reflected in our syllabi and throughout our curriculum and our program structure and in our everyday classroom practices. Attention to citation might manifest quite differently in different fields, right? And we have lots and lots of different fields represented and reflected here today. But I still want to insist that on looking at them more closely for what they tell us about knowledges and knowers in all of our fields, and for why and how they matter in our teaching. Because in this set of reflections about citational practices, about knowledges and knowers, about visible and invisible relationships and networks, most of you will no doubt by now be recognizing a broad set of questions that gets shorthanded through the acronym EDI or any number of very similar kinds of acronyms. They're a set of questions that permeate and should permeate our institution's many kinds of work that are broadly about inclusion and justice, both very problematic words that I'll return to a little later this morning. If citations are about tracing knowledge and knowers and about how we document and account for those, then they're also about, as I've just said a minute ago, about who and what gets counted or included as knowledge and as knowers, and who doesn't. And if we're going to teach for change, I'm taking just one part of what Christina was talking about, right? If we're going to teach for change, I'm arguing, then we have to take seriously the difference that highlighting these questions as sites of our own investigation can and will make in our classrooms and beyond. Think about number 2. See if this works. Think about number 2. Once again, I'm going to share a link with you. I'm going to share my screen. Look at me, old-handed WebEx here. Share button. Think about number 2. How do you teach about citations? Or how do you talk about citations? What do you say about them? Do you ever feel conflicted or conflict about stressing citations and citational practices? And if so, how? So think about how you teach about citations or how you talk about citations. Oh, fairly instrumental, interesting. Reference anything that's not your own work. Again, you can do this on the screen. You can do this, on a piece of paper. You can just sit and think about it. You can run and get a cup of coffee. This one's generating less conversation. Justice, I love that. That's exactly where I'm going. Not generally applicable to math, so I'm going to get to some ideas about that in a moment. I'll give you just another minute to... Isn't this a cool thing? Even if I ask students to write, I talk nonstop as they're writing, by the way. All right, so getting a lot of the ideas that I thought would come up. They're necessary, they provide evidence. Examples. Learners feel it is punitive. Yes, often. Somebody's still marking over here. Yep. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And go back to you all. Get out of this. Okay. That's what I thought WooClap would be helpful. When I saw it yesterday morning, I was like, that's cool. So instead of marking, that's what I was trying to learn yesterday, was how to do some of this. Reflection number 2, relationships are difficult. All intellectual work is a conversation, I say to students all the time, suggesting or telling them that their course readings and their writing and all of their different kinds of assignments are ways in which they enter into existing conversations and become a part of them, contributing their own knowledges to them. Always read footnotes, endnotes, and bibliographies is my constant advice to students, because that's where you'll see where the conversation is happening and who's a part of it, and then you'll be able to follow up on it. And for the keeners, I opine, always read the acknowledgements, because that's where you'll see who's talking with whom and begin to trace how people are connected, and thus also how ideas are connected. This advice is not unproblematic. In academia, right, as folks were noting already, citations are usually operate to inculcate habits of identifying where and how folks have engaged with each other, either in person, like some of those acknowledgements, on paper, over many different times and places. They're about mapping out and documenting how the parameters of a particular issue is being or has been thought about. And they're about then attributing all those ideas and connections to particular people, to particular sources, to particular events or discoveries or theories. They're about telling a story. Citations are academic ways of legitimizing what we say by noting that that knowledge both comes from somewhere and circulates in particular ways, and then being able to document for others where and how we've come across it and our indebtedness to it. But of course, relationships are complicated and our citational practices are never neutral. Now I'm going to head into something Christina's already said in the introduction. In 2013, Sara Ahmed, in a piece called Making Feminist Points on her Feminist Killjoys blog, I am citing all over the place here, she famously describes citation as a rather successful reproductive technology, a way of reproducing the world around certain bodies, and notes that citational structures can form what we call disciplines. In exploring how the question of citation has implications for what kinds of knowledges and knowers are taken for granted in a variety of academic conferences and contexts, and she talks about conferences and publishing and disciplinary knowledges themselves, Ahmed consistently asks who appears and who does not appear, noting that the reproduction of a discipline can be the reproduction of those techniques of selection, ways of making certain bodies and thematics core to the discipline and others not even part, unquote. As she put it, citational practices are screening practices by which or through which some bodies, some people register and appear, and others are not only absent, but made invisible. The consequences of this naturalized selection, of course, are that some bodies and perspectives are not heard, that many groups of people are not reflected in these knowledges, and that the resulting knowledge is presented as universal rather than contingent and invested. Citations then, as both a presence and an absence, tell us who and what matters and who and what doesn't. Similarly, in a 2018 article in Inside Higher Ed called The Racial Politics of Citation, Victor Ray likewise argues that citation is political. In exploring briefly how, because it's a very short article in Inside Higher Ed, so in exploring briefly how racial exclusion gets perpetuated in civil rights legal scholarship, he, citing somebody else, notes how citational practices create closed circles of knowledge that reinforce patterns of racial exclusions through concretizing and legitimizing the citation of certain thinkers as the field or discipline. Citations, he goes on to note, have real effects. They draw our attention to ideas that supposedly matter. They shape what we are able to think about a given field, unquote. And I'm going to ask what we can think about in a given field. For these authors then, and many others, the political work of pointing out citational practices is to note how they construct ways of knowing and who can know. It is to note that the taken for granted ways of doing our fields inadvertently, usually inadvertently, gatekeep who and what is included in that field and how they're included. So paying attention or noting citational practices is a way to make visible what for so many of us often remains invisible, because we fit into those citational structures, because they reflect us, our bodies, our knowledges, our ways of knowing. We are cited, or we recognize ourselves in what the citations reflect. For those of us who don't fit those structures, of course, they are very visible. And they are what drives us out of academia, or never invites us in or makes room for us in the first place. And so, to be clear about those pieces of advice that I started this reflection section with, right, that I give to students about how they should always follow the citations, my aim in saying that is not, and I talk about this with them too, my aim in saying that is not to inculcate notions of mastering an area by thoroughly knowing its parameters, its participants, its taken for granted knowledges, as we've all done, like through grad school, for instance. Instead, in asking us all to be conscious and mindful about how and where and between whom those scholarly conversations are happening, I want students, I want all of us to be able to identify and know what those maps of knowledge production and dissemination are reproducing. I want them, us, to be able to really deeply understand that knowledge is never neutral or universal, that it always comes from somewhere and someone or someone's, that it is situated, indebted, and contextual, and that it reflects particular networks and relationships. Because then we can become more aware of who is reflected in that and who isn't, in the knowledge itself, as well as in the production of that knowledge, the knowers. And I want them, or all of us, to consider always that this is no doubt the case for all fields, back to that math example, right? For all fields, even those where some ways of knowing might seem more entrenched and given than others. My aim then is to shift our attention in thinking about citational practices away from being concerned only with mastering areas of knowledge to now also thinking of them as sites for asking how citations are working to both produce and delimit a set of knowledges, because that shift can be an important way to also denaturalize those knowledges and to decenter who and what is represented, is presented as valued and validated. Paying attention to citational practices, to the maps of relationships they create and make visible, is a point of entry into then also asking, what are the relationships that are not reflected here, and why not? And have they always been there in some way, but have been made invisible? Like those unnamed women cooks that I mentioned a few minutes ago from my example at the beginning. And it's no accident, as Helke points out, Helke, the author of the article, as Helke points out, that the cooks are largely racialized women, while the cookbook authors are white Western women? What are the consequences, and for whom, of making those invisible relationships now visible and in the disciplines? And what and who gets decentered in that process? Making evident relational maps of citational practices is to inculcate, I realize inculcate's my favorite word because this is the third time I'm using it today, is to inculcate a radical doubt about all those close circles of knowledge that Victor Ray was pointing us to. I want to use citations as a way of teaching I want to use citations as a way of teaching that what is included may sometimes not be as important as what is excluded. Because those questions of exclusion might be where we can begin to undo and unlearn the largely invisibilized ways in which knowledge systems so easily reproduce systems of exclusion and injustice for far too many people in our classrooms and on our campuses and everywhere else too. Think about number 3. Nope. I'm going to share another link with you. I'm going to use WooClap in my classes. Share a screen. Think about number 3. Do you have particular readings or resources, authors, or even examples that are your go-tos for your teaching? Have you ever thought about why that is? And what might it take to get all of us, to rethink some of these intellectual and pedagogical habits? What I've been trying to emphasize is the idea that our citational practices are habits, right? They're how we come to know things. We have go-tos for efficiency, of course. So do we have particular readings and resources, authors, examples that we pull, we use them all the time? And then think about, what are they saying? Mm-hmm. I know they happen fast, but hopefully people are able to catch some of what's going by. Digging deeper into who or what isn't represented. I'm losing it. Takes a lot more effort. It takes time, definitely. Back to Christina's point about time, right? Yeah. Give this another minute. Each of my think abouts is generating a little less, I'm noticing. It may be generating people's thinking, and maybe you're scrawling on paper. Oh, I like the idea. I like the idea that our go-to list is often one that's been around for a very long time and that we're attached to for all sorts of reasons. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right. I see there's so much happening in the chat, which I'm not paying any attention to right now. So,
yeah, and people are just commenting that the idea that you're using just think about is great. It really is get kind of triggers you appropriately. And Jana Rosales has commented that she appreciates the perspectives to Mull as they apply to science and engineering, where it's assumed that citations are objective, or that there is only one type of knowledge. So that's it's interesting. And Walter Ochesky is commenting that an example may help in this conceptual question. Would Darwin's theory of evolution via natural selection count as original thought? And he goes on to say, why do we pluralize knowledge? Would Newton's law of gravity actually be British? So, yeah.
I'm going to talk about romantic poetry, maybe in the Q&A at the end. These are great questions. I'm going to move into a couple of quick examples right now, which might help a little bit. But cool, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. All right, reflection number 3, storming the gates. So I want to give you 3 very quick examples or anecdotes, and I'm going to paraphrase, obviously, what happened in those examples. Number 1. In the very first class I ever taught that was 100% my own early in my PhD career and a lot of years ago, and which I took a long time to put together because it was the first time I'd done it. And as we all know, syllabi design is an acquired skill. A student noted rather angrily after I presented the syllabus on the first day, do you realize that most of the readings are by women? Number 2. In a class called Sex and Culture about 10 years ago, a student who had always been attentive but fairly quiet, very smart, fairly quiet much of the time, piped up one day to note, you know, I just realized that in so many of the case studies in my major, they're always about heterosexual families, mom and dad and kids doing expected gender-specific things. Number 3. At a teaching event on campus here, several years ago, shortly after the 2015 TRC report was released, and when our discussion that day was about indigenizing the curriculum, a colleague asked, so do I only put Indigenous content in my syllabus when I have Indigenous students in the class? Exploring citational practices, as I've been doing, is not just academic or theoretical, an academic or theoretical matter, as we've been thinking about, precisely because they're the gatekeeping practices masked as just the way things are or just what our fields do, that too often remain unacknowledged for their unintended consequences, or to use a language many of us know, maybe for their hidden curriculum. And if they are ever noted, it's usually to register them as really important moments of some sort. But as the authors I've quoted above, many others and with them, demonstrate so compellingly, citational practices replicate relationships of knowledge and knowers that are always also about gender and race and disability and sexuality and indigeneity and national identity and language, to name just a few possibilities, although rarely recognized as such. And in their taken for grantedness, they tell a story that recognizes and legitimizes a very limited group of people as occupying either of the position of knowledge or knower. And what are the costs of this? So what if we shift our attention to citational practices in all of our fields, which is part of what I've been trying to do, and especially in how they inform our teaching? What if in identifying and exploring these practices, we don't replicate them, but instead make them invitations into knowing and into this institution within which we all work, we're all attached to today, knowing that we're all attached in very different ways? What if we use citations as a way to return to that idea of relationships, but ask now, what kinds of relationships do we want in our teaching, in our classrooms, in our universities? Who's not in the room right now, quite literally, as either the subject of knowledge or the knowers or the students? How can we use citational practices to engender more inclusive and just pedagogies? If citational structures, to repeat Ahmed's point, construct disciplines, then they not only position all of us, within those disciplines, they obviously inform our pedagogies, our syllabi, our program structures, what we do in the classroom, and thus investigating citational practices has to become central to our teaching if we are committed to thinking about who is included and excluded in that teaching, if we are committed to thinking about teaching for change. So I want to consider 3 interrelated framing questions that come out of my 3 brief examples at the beginning of this reflection. And you'll notice that each of those stress something different. To think about how we might use attention to citational practices as what I want to call disruptive technologies. Instead of that reproductive technologies that Ahmed talked about, disruptive technologies. 1, who's on the syllabus? 2, what examples are we mobilizing in our pedagogical practice? 3, who's in the classroom? Let me start with 1, who's on the syllabus? Remember that student's comment about whether I had noticed that most of the readings were by women? Well, they weren't, right? Some of them were, but they weren't. And I hadn't noticed at the time. And although I didn't think about it in this way at the time, I've returned often to that story. That story's like, anyways, it's a long time ago. Yeah, it's well over 25 years ago. And I still remember it so clearly, and I still use it, and I'm using it again today. So I return to that story often, and I use it in classes as an example in talking about what citational practices do, about how they create those closed circles of what comes to be expected as what is knowledge and who is a knower. Clearly, who was validated and valued as a producer of knowledge for that student wasn't the many women's or what she assumed to be women identifying people's names on that syllabus. So I'm using that example now to ask us to consider how we can consciously disrupt our fields through thoughtful exploration of who and what is missing. I'm thinking here both of the knowledges or subject matter and the voices or knowers that are absent or invisible. What would our classes look like if our syllabi were ways to interject both knowledges and knowledge producers, not usually thought of as central to a course or a program curricula more broadly? And could we do this in all of our courses, not just the upper year special topics courses, right, that always seem to be electives, not core to our fields? But could we do it also in that ubiquitous intro course that is the mainstay of most of our program's disciplines? And what would our fields look like? 2, what about the examples we so readily mobilize? Of course, some of what I've said might seem more obvious or easier to do for humanities and social science fields, where syllabi are more fluid and less structured by the demands of accreditation that dominate many kinds of fields in the university. Although I think it's possible and necessary there also. But think also now of my second anecdote, the one about the student comment that the examples in her texts and in her classes were always similarly focused on heterosexual, heteronormative family structures and gender roles. And I think about who is reflected and recognized in those examples, and who is constantly not seeing themselves in the course materials or the classroom practices and explanations of those materials. Could our everyday ways of doing our many different fields begin to disrupt citational practices by identifying how norms of inclusion and exclusion are replicated through something as seemingly innocuous as an example mobilized in the class, or a way of explaining something that might seem inconsequential, but taken all together may not be? What else might be made possible? What other relations might become more visible in something perhaps as easy as altering who and what circulates in the classroom's everyday talk? 3, finally, who's in the classroom? And think now about that third anecdote of the colleague who questioned whether we only tailor our syllabi to who's in the classroom. Of course, I want to immediately reply, well, how would you even know that to begin with? And doesn't that question imply that there's still a basic what the field is that is only added onto for some of you if you're in the class? But what if we flip that question and instead asked, as I noted earlier, who do we want to be in that room? Which might mean also identifying who isn't there right now, both physically and in those class materials. Are our citational practices, our closed circles of knowledge, a barrier to some people finding us, finding our classrooms, knowing that they're always just added in or accommodated when they show up, if they show up? Or if they have found our classes, do they see themselves reflected in any way? Or is the knowledge of that room always knowledge about rather than knowledge from or knowledge by? How are the students in the room being positioned in relationship to the classroom content and the classroom practices? This is about not just can they enter the conversation, but about on what terms are they being invited to enter? Or maybe not invited, are they entering? Think back to my advice right from earlier about to students to always read the citations and what happens when they realize they're nowhere in that conversation, in those named relationships, which they no doubt knew beforehand anyways. The kinds of disruptions I've only briefly suggested here are calls for thinking about how to make our citational practices, the ones that underlie all of our teaching, more inclusive. But inclusion is a tricky idea, of course, and has to be more than just an add and stir or tokenism. There's obviously a much longer conversation here and a whole other presentation. Oh, I'm so looking forward to the chat. Sorry, there's a much longer conversation and a whole other presentation here, but inclusion always raises the accompanying question about the terms of that inclusion. I don't want inclusion of different topics, of different knowers, of different examples and explanations to simply be an add-on to the real field, but instead I want it to be that which challenges ideas about who and what that field is in the first place. Paying attention to citational practices, not just about what is present, but about how it is present. And so that's the how it matters part of the title of my talk today, to go way back to the beginning. Because citation is that which we all do naturally, right? Supposedly naturally, because it's just what the field is. Disrupting it in these conscious ways means doing more than just adding something in, because it means making visible the invisible or that which has been made invisible. It means looking again at how our taken for granted ways of doing our fields are indeed reproductive technologies that have long excluded in so many ways, so many groups of people. And to repeat a point that I made earlier in this talk, it is to recognize that our too often easily repeated citational practices are always also power differences. They're differences of access, of voice, of recognition, of value. And that consciously disrupting them can work to make those inequities in our teaching more visible. There's no easy way to end this, and indeed, I don't have an ending. These are conversations that I love to have and can go on about forever. So let me finish this really abruptly with a fourth think about, by turning to you all to ask you to think now about, let me get it up on the screen, and realizing that this might be something that needs more thinking about than what might happen on this screen very quickly. My last one. There we go. Share the screen. My last think about. What are some citational practices you want to challenge? And these can be in whatever ways you're involved in teaching and learning. How would you explain the importance of what you're thinking about, right? What you want to challenge to colleagues perhaps more resistant to this idea, or perhaps not here right now anyways? I'll give you a couple of minutes to just reflect. I don't actually know what time this ends. What time does this end?
10:15, eh? Or
10:15.
10:30, sorry. No, 10:30. Half hour remaining.
So half an hour remaining. Oh, so we could have a long conversation. I could put you in groups and let you do things in groups. How? I know one cites me. Oh, there's the networks. Sorry, I'm looking at the sociologist told me. There's the networks.
Dr. Braithwaite, we can't see the screen. It's not shared at the moment.
Oh, really? I'm sorry. Share. There we go. Thanks for that. Down with et al. Underrepresented scholars are too often deleted by et al. There was a wonderful short article. I have a bibliography after if people want to see that too. But there was a short article recently in Nature online, like a month ago, that was thinking about if you've been following or seen the hashtag Cite Black Women movement, that the ways in which racialized scholars, Black women in particular, are being excluded from cited but not named, not acknowledged. Yeah, textbooks. I like the way math classes keep coming up here. I have a colleague here who teaches, well, now she's the dean of science, but she teaches in chemistry. And I guess the word trans is something in chemistry, I don't know, but she says she always starts by thinking about how is trans used much, sort of much more popularly in everyday language. And it's, I guess, getting at some of the same ideas. So she's bringing a kind of a different way of a different kind of example or a different way to explain the notion of trans to her chemistry class. I can't go any further than that because I don't know what it is in chemistry. I'm going to stop sharing so we can. And stop sharing and hope that we can have a conversation. Thank you all very much for being such attentive listeners so early in the morning. Thanks.
That was fantastic, Anne. There's a lot going on in the chat, as you've remarked. I think, a lot of the conversation is centering around your notion around our challenging our own feeling about being an expert in things in our field. Jana notes questioning what counts as knowledge in our field and why might feel like it's shaking some foundations of our own expertise. And a lot of follow-up on Julie remarks. We can have a lot of personally invested in our own expertise. Sometimes we hold on too tightly to how we were trained and what we ourselves were taught was canon, and it can prevent us from opening to a wider range of perspectives. Interesting, the ideas and that we're kind of percolating on here and sharing. And one important thing Joelle has remarked around this idea of as we move forward in especially during these times, the increasing amount of workload that's put on us and things that is a barrier for us to stop and kind of think about, our own knowledge and our own expertise and how we shape that and how it is shaped. And who's involved in the conversation with us, as you point out, right?
So a couple of quick comments. Just that question of sort of workload, right? This is done in community. This is not done alone. I am not sort of advocating that we all go home and find a part of our bookcase we've never read and start, right? I think this is community. This is what we're doing here today. This is what we make sort of the subject of seminars and panel discussions and conferences and, all the different ways in which we already come together to kind of exchange our citational practices with each other, those are the occasions or moments which we could make more visible this set of questions, right? So I'm it is more work. I'm not going to say it's not, right? And I'm looking at some of the questions and saying, like, I actually don't have answers to some of this, right? Because they're not necessarily in my area. But I'm asking us to think about together, right, with our colleagues, with our departments, with our disciplinary colleagues, but also across our disciplinary lines, the ways in which these everyday practices function to include and exclude all sorts of groups of people. And so I'll give you 2 quick examples. Last year, anyways, in the middle of COVID, I taught a course called Bodies, Health, and Disease, right, which was a kind of cultural studies approach to this. And the first part of the course was thinking about ways in which, pandemics have always been sort of the blame for pandemics has always been racialized and been put on other people. Think about the attempts to sort of blame COVID on Chinese or just Asian writ large, right? And there were people in the class, number of students, who were zooming in from Nigeria and South Africa, and they were very aware of the ways in which access to things like vaccines, which was just beginning, this was winter 2020, or, all the way like flight bans and so forth, right? They were very aware of all of the ways in which that impacted them. And the readings made place for those conversations to happen, because we looked at, sort of readings about how white folks over here in the US and Canada did the same thing around HIV, et cetera, right? So that they found out there was a way, those readings, right, that syllabus was a way to invite the many kinds of conversations, experiences, and people who were in the classroom. I didn't have to know who was in the classroom to begin with, because that's what I wanted to disrupt, right, was the notion that, of course, it makes perfect sense to do this thing. My second quick example is, I remember years ago talking to an old friend who's one of my professors in Cégep. I grew up in Montreal, was one of my professors in Cégep. So I was seeing him for like the first time in 30 years, right? And we were talking about indigenizing and so forth. And he was like, well, I really resist that, because does that mean that I have to find indigenous romantic poets to add to my syllabus? And I was like, not necessarily. I'm sure some exist. But it is to at least make that the fact that who the romantic poets are and what has become the area called romantic poetry, to make evident, right, to make that part of the conversation of the classroom, how romantic poetry has been, who that reflects and how it's been constructed as a particular area in a field called English literature. So it's, I guess, going back to my question of, examples and so forth, it's like, well, there are lots of ways to make these conversations enter the classroom. But I think what I'm calling for the most is to make them enter the classroom, right? Be very sort of conscious, make them consciously enter the classroom. Other questions or comments? I could scroll quickly the chat, but there's a Q&A too. I don't know if anything's happening in the Q&A, but.
No, there's not. Everything is taking place. Great conversation and comments in the chat. People posting some examples themselves and some references to your comments, Anne. Joelle does point out again that I think it's important to question the assumptions that undergird this idea of working in community, which she says I am 100% all for, but finding that community is also a form of work.
Mm-hmm. So that's such an important point, and I really want to recognize that disrupting a disciplinary, taken for granted citational practices, i.e. knowledge, is work that can be undertaken, and by people like me, right? I'm a full professor, here I am, I can organize conferences, set up panels, I can do all kinds of stuff that if you're precarious labor is much more difficult, right? And is much more difficult, obviously, if you're not sort of fully tenured yet, if you're lucky enough to have one of those elusive tenure track positions. So we are all implicated in this profession in very different ways. And I think that's really important to point out. But I also think that if a whole bunch of us are asking these questions, that's an invitation to precarious labor, for instance, to say, I've been thinking about that too, right? Because it's a way of, quote unquote, normalizing the kinds of questions that I want us all to be engaged in.
And Brady Reed has a question for you. What is your advice to a very early career researcher? I have only ever taught 2 courses to diversify your advice on diversifying syllabi when Brady is still himself getting familiar with the field, and of course noticing the voices are not validated. Whose voices are not validated.
So, I mean, I think about, sometimes you're just given a syllabus, right? You're teaching the intro course. You're one of like 5 sections of it here. This is what you're doing. And people were mentioning before about, how textbooks and so forth, the citational practices in textbooks, which are always fascinating. But so I think about like, there's just not a lot of flexibility in what you have to do, but there is flexibility in how you do it, right? So just something like this, Brady, about noting whose voices are not validated, I would mention that, right? That there's ways, I mean, we have multiple layers of conversations happening in classrooms all the time. So there's ways to say something like, have you noticed, right, that all of the examples, and going back to one of my examples, that all of the examples in this textbook all presume mom and dad? Woo, let's have a conversation about that, right? So that's a way of at least sort of signaling, without saying, let's talk about citational practices, class, but that's a way of signaling, right away that there's a particular construction of knowledge going on here that just assumes a whole bunch of stuff that we might want to question. So it's starting small, Brady, I think is my point here. It's starting small. And sometimes people have a lot of flexibility and possibility, and other times, our interjections are much briefer. But I think the interjections, for me, they have to be there.
Beth Ann Austin is asking any thoughts on how to apply these ideas to something like introductory math courses where the skills have been in place for hundreds of years.
So I don't know a lot about this, and I'm going to start chasing after my math colleagues about this. But I think about, I mean, we know, so my social media tells me, right, that we know that there are invisibilized voices in the history of math, right? We know that, I think about just like hidden figures or something, right? So we maybe, again, back to the same thing I was saying to Brady. I mean, you just kind of, your interjections are brief about, isn't it interesting that, all of the math people that we're citing were all a bunch of guys, that, where was that, because women weren't doing math, or is it because we just don't know about them? So, I mean, I think there are just brief ways to call attention to even the knowledges that seems really set, right? That the stories we tell about that knowledge, right, might be stories that we want to disrupt. I used to have this conversation with someone a long time ago about how the 1,000-pound rock will always get me, right? And it was like, of course it'll get me. I mean, gravity is a thing, right? If a 1,000-pound rock falls, it's going to squish me no matter whether I say, oh, let's, but let's tell the story about, or let's think about how the story of the 1,000-pound rock, how the history of gravity, how, all the ways in which we think about gravity might reflect particular people's input into that knowledge. I am fascinated that here I am talking about all the science stuff, which is just kind of like not really me, but I want us I leave that work up to my colleagues. Again, this is why it's done in community, right? People have lots to contribute and lots of knowledges that are very different from each other. But I want us to just think about, where is that knowledge coming from? So, sorry, Kim, you're going to read me Erica's question?
No, you go right ahead. If you're finishing a thought there, go right for it.
Well, I just remember it might have been at the same sort of, when the example I used about when we were teaching event when we were talking about indigenizing the curriculum. And somebody pointed out, I love this, that, you know, instead of using an example, for instance, like in an engineering class about building a bridge, use the example of building an igloo, which is an engineering feat of all kinds, but is never used as the everyday example, right? And so what hierarchies of knowledge, right? What hierarchies of building are we perpetuating by always using particular kinds of examples? Although, of course, you know, people are like, oh, the pyramids. But there might be ways in which we can really mix up our examples, right? To highlight that there are lots of different ways in which the things we are teaching, our equations, if you will, right, in this field can be explained in multiple ways. Like my colleague who does it with thinking about trans in chemistry class. And I noticed somebody gave us the trans and cis definitions earlier in the chat.
You know, and it just triggered a thought for me. I remembered a couple of years ago when I had the aha moment around that too. I remember Dr. Noreen Golfman was during Indigenous Week sharing an example. She's our former provost.
Yeah.
And she was sharing an example of different ways of knowing in curriculum and how a student in engineering had said to her the same thing, but like the principles by which, and this was an Indigenous student said that the principles by which they knew how to build things on the land are not taught in his courses, which is interesting because there's a whole different set of ideas around how to build structures. And, you know, that was the kind of her aha moment helped me with go, oh, wow, that makes so much sense, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, just trying to get back to Catherine Pendenkus had a question. Is the discussion of the politics of citation something you introduce to students in all or most of your classes?
Yes, but I think, you know, I teach diversity and social justice studies. I mean, this is what I teach, right, is who's included and who's excluded, how the world around us is never neutral, but always reflects only certain ways of being in that world. And so, yes, I mean, I do because it's what the field is, right? But I think that I'm going back to my earlier example. I think that, and you know, part of the discussion we had around Brady's question, that this is something that we can introduce at every level, right? And we introduce it differently. I mean, I do, you know, my theorizing social justice class, we do, you know, like a few weeks on this idea of citational practices, and whose voices and whose stories and how you tell stories about beginnings and all that kind of stuff. But even in the intro class, I think we can intervene into, instead of saying, here's the knowledge, right? We can intervene in that, even if that's what we have to present, we can intervene by saying, well, let's also ask some questions about where it comes from and who's included. And back to Kim's point from a moment ago, whose ways of understanding the world are not part of this textbook right now. And this is not to suggest, no, I'm not going to go there. I think, well, yes, I will. Because then we run into, people bring up all sorts of questions about sort of, you know, excellence and standards and all that kind of stuff, right? And I mean, part of what we think we're doing so often in university is training people in particular fields, right? Which means, especially when you get to grad school, which means training them in particular ways of knowing. But I think that we can start even at the 1000 level of intervening in those ways of knowing by just getting people to ask questions about, like, you know, who's not here. And this is to also recognize that for any number of people in your classes who you may not necessarily know, they're already recognizing they're not there, right? If all of those heteronormative family structure things are happening in those textbooks, what about all the LGBTQ students who aren't identifying as heteronormative necessarily, right? What about other kinds of familial structures that are often racialized and indigenous, for instance? So all kinds of people are already recognizing, right? Part of what I'm thinking about or asking us to think about here is for folks who embody, right? Somebody said earlier, like, we people like me decolonize, we don't indigenize, and I completely agree. That I want people who kind of look like me to be asking these questions, because so often I fit, not always, but so often I fit into those citational structures. I knew Heidegger would turn. So that actually makes, I'm going to have another quick story. I had this conversation with my current dean a gazillion times, who is a philosopher, right? And he thinks about, so, you know, do I add, so what this conversation basically comes down to, do I add a week on indigenous philosophy or African philosophy? It's like there are a lot of countries there, African philosophy into my intro to philosophy class. And it's like, well, that's one way. It feels a little tokenistic to me. Or you couldn't you organize an intro to philosophy class quite differently? And make different kinds of questions, which pull in lots of different voices and lots of different representation, part of that philosophy class, instead of what so often happens, which is you add indigenous philosophy as if it's one thing to the last week, and then you have snow days, and then you have to cancel the last week because you ran out of time.
I actually had a question, or maybe a comment, I'm not sure.
Go for it.
And I like asking it as a person.
I love that.
Yeah, I'm from philosophy actually as well. And I find that the discipline is super bifurcated into the people who do traditional philosophy and the people who do sort of more critical contemporary issues and so on. And with regard to, I mean, I think it's important for just to think about that issue of citational practices as a living issue, right? So what are the contemporary issues that mobilize the traditional resources differently? What are the traditional resources that could be useful for the contemporary issues? But there's not a lot of traffic between those two camps, right? And citational practices, I think, are a matter of not just putting things side by side, but using concerns from the present to animate the tradition and using the powers of the tradition to address the concerns of the present. I'm biased. This is what I do in philosophy. I read Hegel and Merleau-Ponty, and I talk about, you know, contemporary political problems. But I feel like the issue is not just, as I think that you're saying, the issue is not just putting things side by side, but really working with things to cross that boundary between the traditional and the critical present. And I wonder about what you think about that.
I've been nodding the whole time. I love that. I think about Toni Morrison, right? Sort of a lot of years ago in a little set of lectures called Playing in the Dark, thinks about how she, or talks about how she can teach sort of Black studies by reading only white authors, right? So it's because it's about sort of what kind of critical frameworks are we bringing to the materials that we're talking about, right? So I love that. I love the language of animation because I think that's really important. And I want to yell at all the anti-critical race theory who have no idea what they're talking about in the US. It's like, go read Toni Morrison. Right? Like, yeah, anyways. Because we could talk a lot about critical race theory without ever talking about particular knowers. And yet that also makes me really uncomfortable, right? I think that you could teach nothing but sort of dead white European men philosophers and animate them really differently. But then there's still the question about who are the knowers who have been made invisible and all of that. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I animate. I love that.
Thanks.
And I'll just note that Gavin Watson in the chat has noted about, you know, how we kind of more broadly get at some of these issues and matters. And he asked the question, drawing parallels to the knowledge that underpins a field or a syllabus. Does a unit like a center for teaching and learning need to widen the scope, change structures to more broadly support instructors?
My experience at UPEI is that we now have a teaching and learning center for, you know, throughout most of COVID. We had nothing. We have some e-learning people, right, who've been fabulous. But my experience is that these tend to be maybe not at MUN. My sense is not, right? But at many universities, they're done off the side of desks and they're under-supported and under-resourced and so forth. So I am not here to say, let's put more work on very few people. But I think it's something we can all be a part of, right? So for instance, I'm the unchair, because we decided we didn't want to we didn't want to perpetuate that structure. So I'm the unchair of the new equity committee for Stelly Stops. And one of the things we're talking about is precisely this, right? How do we sort of think about equity, justice, inclusion, accessibility, much more broadly through our curricular and classroom practices. So I know that some universities like UTSC are producing a bunch of work around equity in curriculum, right? Which they promised to share with us as soon as they're ready to share it. So I think there's lots of room, and I think there's, many of us have contributions to make to that. So volunteer to do something with at my university at least, because we have one part-time person. This can only happen if people volunteer.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
And just noting the time here, we're coming close to the end. If anybody has another quick question for Anne before we clue up, certainly can have that moment now.
It's always a conversational stopper, right?
Yes, I was just going to say I've stopped the bus, but no, it's been a great, very stimulating, very interesting, and I can't thank you enough for that. It certainly, for me, I feel vulnerable going into the conference, which is a good place to be, like that place of just open and ready to, see what I can learn and need to learn more about. And I know I will as I go forth from this session, and I hope others feel the same way. It's been tremendous. Thank you very, very much for this.